Welcome to part 2 of the Live Energy Connect Configuration Manager tutorial. This is the second video in a 3-part series demonstrating how to use your LEC Configuration Manager. Before you begin with part 2 of this tutorial, we recommend you watch the LEC Configuration Manager introductory video in part 1 of this tutorial on Oracle University at education.oracle.com. In part 2 of this tutorial, I will show you how to start and stop the LEC server, create a new LEC server configuration alias, and adjust LEC server startup parameters. In this demo, I'll start and stop the LEC server. I'll also run LEC server configurations as Windows Managed Services. You can also run them as standalone processes by using the Start Server Process button. The default LEC server configuration alias called CFG already has a Windows service registered after you install the LEC Configuration Manager. I'll also be creating a new configuration alias. Configuration aliases, as I mentioned in part 1 of this tutorial, are used to organize and manage multiple LEC server configurations on the same computer. Any configurations created, edited, or viewed in LEC Configuration Manager are associated with a configuration alias. Typically, customers will only use one LEC server instance per computer in production. By convention, the configuration alias you will use is the default configuration alias called CFG. I'll also be importing another example LEC server configuration that will simulate a peer SCADA system, and I'll also load the LEC server batch files for that configuration. In this demo, the LEC server instance simulating a peer SCADA system will act as an ICCP server, and the main or default LEC server instance called CFG will act as an ICCP client. The ICCP client will receive real-time information reports about points on the peer SCADA system and log that information to a file. Finally, I'll show you how to adjust the server parameters for the LEC server instance acting as a peer SCADA system so you can run the two LEC server instances simultaneously on the same computer. Each LEC server instance needs 2 ports specified at startup to successfully run. One port is used to communicate between the configuration manager and LEC server using a simple object access protocol or SOAP protocol. The other port, the manufacturing message specification or MMS port, is used to communicate between the virtual manufacturing devices or VMDs inside and outside the server. The default port for SOAP is 8089 and the default port for MMS is 102. These are the parameters that the LEC server will use when running the CFG LEC server instance. 2 LEC server instances running simultaneously on the same machine can't use the same MMS and SOAP ports. So when we run the SCADA simulator LEC configuration, we will need to specify that we want LEC server to use different MMS and SOAP ports for that LEC server instance. So we'll need to make sure the other LEC server instance is configured to use different ports. But it's important to remember, most customers will not need to adjust these ports because they will only run one LEC server instance on a single computer. Now, let's jump into our demo. You may remember this LEC server configuration that we loaded in part 1 of our tutorial. It was loaded into the CFG configuration alias, and one batch file, iccppoints.csv, as you can see in our Properties panel, is currently loaded. So now we'll need to start the LEC server. The server usually runs as a Windows Managed Service, and by default, the CFG configuration alias already has a Windows service registered after you install LEC. To start the Windows service, click Start Service CFG from the menu bar. You can also click the Services tab from the central panel and click Start under the command column. We can see here that the server is running. Let's take a look at the Network Monitor tab from the central panel. You can see that right now the server is running and it's listening for a connection to the remote VCC called VCCB. So our LEC server is ready to make an ICCP association when that remote server makes a connection attempt. While the server is running, we can also take a look at our log. To do this, click the Log Files tab from the central panel. This will show you a live view of the LEC server log. You can make the log more or less verbose by changing the log levels in the fields called Manager Level and Transport Level. To learn more about logging levels, refer to the Configuration Manager user manual. Now, let's go ahead and stop the server so we can work on setting up the other LEC configuration that we'll use to simulate a SCADA system. To stop it, click Stop Service from the menu bar. Or you can click the Services tab from the central panel and click Stop under the command column, just like we did when we started the service. Perfect. Now we're ready to create a new configuration alias. From the File menu, I'll go ahead and click New Alias. And in the Alias field, I'll type SCADA SIM. And I'll click OK. Since we're going to import a configuration file, I'll click OK to ignore this message for now. I'll reload macros later after I import the configuration file I'll be working with. With this new alias, I need to import another example configuration file that contains the LEC configuration needed to simulate a remote SCADA system. To do that, I'll need to go to the File menu and click Import Configuration. I'll navigate to my C drive, then to Program Data, and open the Live Energy Connect folder. From the list of files, I'll select ICCP server sim.db and click Open. If you get this message, it means there is already a configuration file open for this alias, and it's asking you to save the currently loaded configuration file. I'll click OK because I don't want to save this empty configuration file associated with the SCADA SIM alias. As I mentioned in part 1 of this tutorial, when you get this message, it means the configuration file doesn't have the latest macros, so we need to reload macros. I'll click OK to close this message. And from the File menu, I'll click Reload Macros. I'll click OK because the LEC server needs to be running to reload macros. Perfect. Now we have our configuration file imported. Let's load a batch file. Click File, Load Batch Share. I'll navigate to my C drive, then Program Data, then Live Energy Connect, and then I'll open my config folder. From the list of files, I'll select ICCP simpoints.csv, and I'll click Open. Awesome. Now we have our configuration file imported and our batch file loaded. We'll need to adjust the server parameters for the simulated SCADA configuration. Like I mentioned earlier in this tutorial, the LEC server needs to have 2 ports specified at startup to run successfully. Remember, most customers will not need to adjust these ports because they will only run one LEC server instance on one computer. For the purposes of this tutorial, we will change the ports used by the instance simulating the SCADA server configuration because 2 instances can't use the same port on the same computer at the same time. To make these adjustments, I'll go over to the Properties panel on the bottom right side of the application and click the Server tab. I'll change the SOAP port from 8089 to 8090. And I'll change the MMS port from 102 to 103. And I'll click Apply. Excellent. In the next tutorial, we'll run both LEC server instances and demonstrate real-time communication between the 2 peers over ICCP. In part 2 of this tutorial, you learned how to start and stop the LEC server, create a new LEC server configuration alias, and adjust LEC server startup parameters. Be on the lookout for additional videos in this series on Oracle University at education.oracle.com. Thanks for watching, and be well.